Vincent. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It's great to be back amongst you again. And I want to thank Vincent very much for the invitation to talk to you. It's also a great pleasure because my topic today is something that's very, very dear to my heart. And it's been a privilege for me to have worked for the last 5 years with a wonderful group of people who have been developing the iCub Humanoid robot, specifically as a platform, as a vehicle, for helping the community in Europe and worldwide develop enactive embodied cognitive systems. This is the iCub that we have today. It's a sophisticated mechatronic platform, as well as being a very sophisticated software system. There are 53 degrees of freedom. It's got dexterous manipulation, very good hand-eye coordination, very good gaze control. So what I'm going to do for the first 20 minutes or so is take you on a short tour of the iCub to give you an impression of its capabilities. I have to say that this is going to be a sample of its capabilities. I can't cover everything that we've been doing in a short period, but I think that you'll have a good idea of exactly what we're talking about at the end. Let me first show you a short video of the iCub when it was first assembled, when all of it was put together. Here, doing some yoga. And it shows you the degrees of freedom that it has. I'm a messenger here today, and I want to make that as clear as I possibly can. You cannot build something like the iCub without an enormous team of people. There are over 100 people who have been involved in the project for the last several years. But of course, every team needs leaders. And with the 11 institutes that have been involved in this, here are some of the leaders. If I've left some out, I do apologize. You always commit a sin of omission inevitably when you try to do this. I want to single out, of course, one or two extra people. Giulio Sandini was the original mastermind for this project, and the idea of creating a platform that could be used across the community to share results in embodied cognitive development. And Giorgio Metta was the person who drove it from start to finish, and I think also the person who survived it without a great deal of sleep over the last 5 years. What's also important is that the rest of the team is very highly multidisciplinary. We've got people from robotics, from computational modeling, and most importantly, and it's a great privilege to follow on from Linda's talk, most importantly, people from developmental psychology and neuroscience. And I want to emphasize that the work that I'll show you today was driven, often quite forcibly, by the psychologists and the neuroscientists. The roboticists and the computational modelers weren't always as faithful to what they wanted as the psychologists and neuroscientists wanted, but we did try. Also, as I go through the talk, I'll try and pick out the various teams that made a contribution to different aspects of the development of the iCub. Let me begin so with the design of the head itself. This was developed in Lisbon with IST. It's a particularly nice head. I like working with it greatly. It's got very good saccadic eye movement, as we'll see, and some very good smooth pursuit movement as well. The face and cover, which turns out to be very important for interaction studies, was also designed at IST. And something that wasn't anticipated when we originally designed the platform itself was to put in some form of simple facial expressions. And again, this has been an important aspect of using the iCub with natural studies with human subjects, apart from being a lot of fun, which is also the case. Of course, the head is there for a reason. The reason is to look around the place and to see things. And to hear things as well, not just to hear. There's a binaural sound localization system also in the iCub with a special pinna, which does lateral and vertical sound localization. What's significant is that our model of smooth pursuit and saccade was driven again by developmental psychology. And Klaas van Hofsten in Uppsala allowed us access to his work on young children who weren't particularly good at smooth pursuit, and then later on other kids who developed a much better faculty at smooth pursuit. This then allowed us to build a computational model, and true to integrating with developmental psychology, we put the iCub back where the humans used to be and subjected it to the same tests. In addition to smooth pursuit, of course, humans are also very good at tracking through occlusion. And it's an interesting fact that when we track through occlusion, we track to the point where the object disappears, we stop, and then saccade exactly at the right point when the object would reappear, rather than what we as roboticists and computational scientists thought, tracking directly to where we had expected the object to appear, stop and wait, and then continue. So that's the model of smooth pursuit and saccading through occlusion. And you can see the difference in development in neonates in this particular instance. And the iCub can do the same thing. So it's got particularly nice, natural, smooth pursuit, predictive control of its gaze. Following on from that, we turned our focus to attention. We learned a great deal from working with the people in Ferrara, Luciano Fadiga in neuroscience, and also from work that Klaas van Hofsten had done in developmental psychology. In this case, this is not attention. This is what Linda was saying. This is eye gaze. This is just a way of recording where babies are looking as they're moved around a natural environment. This was done specifically to try and understand what would be salient in building our computational model of attention. And I'll point out here, while this video is going on, that Linda showed a picture of the EUCogII architecture for saliency-based computational attention. It's exactly that model, which has been implemented in the iCub. The same sort of experiments helped inform us when we were building our computational models of infant gaze and how they look around them, what they look at, and what's important. And this is again for what I would call exogenous or outside-driven visual attention, what's sometimes referred to as bottom-up attention. That's a term that we avoid. I'll explain why later on. This led us then to a cornerstone of the iCub project, which is our visual attention system, which uses EUCogII salience with a number of additional features like flicker, movement, faces, skin, in addition to the standard ones like intensity, Gabor filters for orientation, etc. Significantly as well, the attention system integrates what you're looking at as you move your head around into what we term an egocentric egosphere. So it's a head-centered view or representation of what you've been saccading around and looking at as you attend to various objects of interest and as you fixate, or as the iCub fixates. In addition to purely saliency-based attention, the iCub also has a top-down attention system. This particular one is based on SIFT features, and you can see the two salient features that have been picked out based on effectively SIFT-based object recognition. This then gives us a working attention system, and in this video here, the attention system was turned on while the iCub was being repaired. It's a nice clip because it shows, I think, the very natural saccading of the iCub robot, the way that the gaze moves and then the head follows to recenter. It also shows very nicely the inhibition of return, which is built into the attention system, so that after you've been fixating for a short while, you become habituated and the head then begins to look at something else, which is working around it. What's important here is all of this information is being integrated into this egosphere. So you get this kind of egocentric map of not just your visual field, but of your egos, of the sphere of visual influence around you. iCub also has a hand-eye coordination facility, capability, and its dexterous hands can manipulate light objects as well as heavy objects and objects which are difficult to grasp. And I can deal with round objects as well. So I'll just I'll let this run. There's quite a lot going on here, which may not be self-evident, but there's accommodation because of the torso movement, there's accommodation because of head movement, there's accommodation because of shoulder movement. So there's a lot of movements going on in creating this grasping action. And an action is not a movement. An action is something which is goal-oriented and motivated by a particular desire. The iCub doesn't walk, well, not yet. Eventually, I'm sure it will. It's certainly been designed to be strong enough to. But our initial idea was that it should crawl on the ground just like a baby does. So again, going back to developmental psychology and by studying how young babies do it, the group in EPFL were able to then go and simulate how to create the appropriate gait for crawling and for crawling and sitting up and crawling while reaching as well. So here's a little example of an early design exercise with the iCub. This is about 4 years old. And ultimately it led to something which I only saw about a week ago, the first time that I saw the iCub crawling on the ground. There's a number of other videos I can't show you here where it's crawling and reaching at the same time for a target. But it's effective. The polystyrene around the palms is because the hands are valuable and just in case stuff goes wrong, and it does, we didn't want to wreck 20 or 30,000 euros of machinery. Again, I'm trying to emphasize here the fact that the way that we designed and built the iCub humanoid robot was driven very, very extensively by the neuroscientific and psychological work that was being done with our partners. So the iCub was funded by the European Commission as a platform, not just for our project, but for anybody in Europe and indeed worldwide who wanted to use it. So it is an open source platform. Anyone can download the drawings, the software, the instructions and the documentation and use it under a GPL license. And so far we have 15 iCubs completed and we have 5 more in production. And we're not going to stop there. Eventually, we will take over the world. This is a picture which shows its distribution at the moment around Europe, and I expect this to continue. I'm very happy that one of the iCubs currently being built is going to Stephen Levinson's laboratory in the United States. So it's a European project, but it's also a global project. So that's the humanoid, and I'll stop with that little snapshot of some of its capabilities and what motivated us to build it. And I want now to move on to the specific topic of this morning, which is studying cognition. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between cognition and development. And I'm going to begin by teasing out some of the fundamental premises from which we began on this. And then I'll follow up and show you how we've tried to take these principles from neuroscience and from psychology and from philosophy and use them in building a software-based cognitive architecture and cognitive system on the iCub. This is a picture of a brain. It's a picture I like because it reflects exactly what we've been trying to escape from for the past several years. We've learned a great deal over the last 50 years in which AI has been developing. We've learned, first of all, that there isn't one simple linear pathway from exteroception or perception to cognition and reasoning. In fact, there are many, many pathways, and what's really significant about it is that the pathways are recurrent. There are multiple pathways and there are multiple recurrent pathways, and this is enormously significant for the emergence of and development of cognitive abilities. The second thing that we've learned is you cannot detach your head from your body. Your body is an important part of your cognitive system. It's an intrinsic part of it. And so we've been in the process not just of reattaching the head back onto AI and to cognitive systems, but also into reasserting the importance of manipulation. One of the touchstones of the iCub project and the RobotCub project is that manipulation is central to the emergence and development of cognitive abilities in people, in any agent for that matter. The other thing that's happened in the last several years is the realization that cognitive systems require motivations in order to develop. And so the affective state is as important in the development of cognition as are the reasoning aspects, if you want to put it in those terms. So this is how I prefer to view a computational modeler's view of cognitive systems today. It's a system which certainly has a brain, it certainly has a body, and it also must have a heart. It's the whole system working synergistically together that gives you your cognitive development. So we've gone from an old metaphor or paradigm of functionalist and dualist. The word functionalist is really important here. It implies that you can have a model of cognition and run it on any platform. And of course, our assertion is, of course, that that's not true. Because cognition it emerges as the system interacts with the world. It's fundamentally embodied. And the word that we use today to cover that type of paradigm of cognition is in active systems. So the key message here is that your embodiment plays a constitutive role in the process of cognition. It is not simply a platform upon which you run your cognitive system. It is part of the way cognition and cognitive abilities develop. So we've gone from a view of cognition as thinking to a view of cognition as doing. And that's central to the rationale for the creation of a humanoid robot. Cognition has many different functions. I want to pick out two today. Cognition helps us overcome two barriers that we have with classical systems. The first barrier is what we call the here and now barrier. It allows us to break out of reasoning, thinking, doing at this particular instant and think about how things might be, to anticipate how things might be, and to factor that into how you act in the world. The second barrier that it breaks through is the one that has plagued artificial intelligence for well over 50 years, and this is the prior knowledge barrier. Our old model was that you went out, you modeled the world, you encapsulated that model, and then you embedded it symbolically or otherwise, in the head of your system. And of course, we haven't had a great deal of success with that particular metaphor. Instead, rather, cognition depends on learning. It depends on, as Ben Kuiper said, drinking from the fire hose of experience. But the point here is it's not a passive drinking. It's a very active, selective drinking. And that is what distinguishes developmental cognitive systems from, let's say, statistical learning techniques. And I'll say more about that as the talk progresses. So fundamentally, cognition is here to guide action. It's there to fill in gaps with missing information. It's there because the information that you have and that you glean as you look around is, anyone who works with real systems know it's dirty, it's uncertain, and you have to be able to deal with that. But probably originally, cognition was developed because the information was late, that there are inherent latencies in our feedback process in human physiology. And by the time your cognitive or reactive system was capable of dealing with the stimulus that you were attending to, you were dead. So this speaks to the idea of cognition being a mechanism for living in the future. Living a little bit in the future, or as you develop more and more cognitive abilities, living further in the future. So the two words here are your ability to adapt, and by this I mean making sense of the world, so sense making is important. This will become critical later when I talk about issues of representation and issues of epistemology, that is, the sharing of information and knowledge. And the second issue, which is anticipation, being able to predict, to anticipate, to act prospectively, to think what might happen. So this anticipation, assimilation, adaptation is a process which is ongoing. And it's embedded in a loop of action and perception. So you're predicting future events when you're selecting actions. You're learning from what happens, and then you're updating or amending or modifying your state as a cognitive system in order to make your future predictions better. And all this is done autonomously. And that's critical. So we are dealing here with autonomous systems. And what people often forget when they're dealing with autonomous systems is that as soon as you embrace autonomy as your modus operandi, you give up control. That is to say, you give up your control of the agent with which you're working. And that creates enormous difficulties because as engineers, and I'm an engineer, I want to go back in and I want to fix it when it doesn't work. And the temptation is always to revisit, to fix, to kludge in order to get what I wanted out of the system. In fact, we got it wrong to begin with because we probably didn't get the dynamics right. And so it's the dynamics of interaction, and it's the dynamics of the system itself in its autonomous behavior is what allows cognitive development to progress. This standpoint gives rise to many, many important questions, most of which I'm not going to be able to deal with today. The idea of what motivates cognition, what motivates development, how do you select actions, and what do you need in order to get started? I'll address the latter point in a moment, but I would like to pick out three key issues in developmental cognitive science. The issue of embodiment, so that I can be perfectly clear why we developed a humanoid, why not some other type of embodied robotic system. The second issue of meaning. Francisco Varela put it well in a paper in 1988 when he wrote a paper called Whence Perceptual Meaning? Where does meaning come from? And here we're talking about the meaning of an agent as it explores its world, and the meaning of things to an agent as it exchanges knowledge with other agents, so more formally interagent epistemology. And then finally the key issue, the core focus of this morning and today's talks, that of development. I'll start with meaning. Meaning is, to put it succinctly, negotiated. Meaning isn't absolute. Meaning emerges when agents interact with each other through consensual experience, mediated by action. So it's a negotiated, emergent well, it's negotiated and it's emergent. I was going to say concept, but I think having heard what we talked about this morning, I'm not going to talk about concepts. But the point is, what's meaningful for you is meaningful because of your interaction history with the world as an autonomous agent and your interaction with other agents. Which brings us to embodiment. If you're going to have to interact, you're going to have some way of interacting. And Tom Zimke introduced this very helpful taxonomy of embodiment systems in 2003. And at the very center of it, we have our organismic embodiment. We're working here at the organismoid embodiment, which is effectively humanoid in this case. The thesis, put simply, is that if meaning is based on shared epistemology and a shared experience, you need a compatible embodiment. And we're interested in interacting with artificial cognitive agents, and so our thesis is that we need to share the same experiences, and therefore we need to share, to an extent, the same form of embodiment. And so that's what drives the rationale for humanoid embodiment rather than mobile robots or wheelchairs or something like that. Larson probably captured what I'm trying to say best with a cartoon several years ago when he had a little clip about what dogs think of us when we're telling them to stay away from the rubbish, because this is actually what they hear. They don't share our same experiences. They have a different interaction history. They have a different set of perception action skills. And so for therefore their epistemology is different from ours. So development then is the progressive ontogenetic acquisition of anticipatory capabilities. So the point is that development is there because when we begin, we have only a limited capability in terms of anticipating future events and a limited capacity to deal with the flux of information that is bombarding us as neonates. And you cannot short-circuit ontogeny. That's really critical. We've been trying to do it for 50 years, and probably much longer. The idea that we can embed into it the rules that we as observers see around us, that can capture the lawfulness of the world around us. But of course that's based on our perception. It's not necessarily a good computational model of what's actually happening. So cognition then, as a developmental process, is necessarily the product of an embodied development. We start off as neonates and as an iCub with being able to deal with immediate events. And the point of cognition is to extend the timescale of your prospection, and as well to extend the richness, the space of your actions in interacting with and dealing with the world. So this means that cognition and perception are functionally dependent on the richness of your action interface. If you don't have a rich manipulator interface, a rich way of interacting with the world, of exploring it, of discovering it, you won't discover rich information. And if it's not compatible with that of say, humans, what you do discover may not be compatible epistemologically. Luke Steele's, I thought, put it really very, very nicely, I think, gosh, was it 3 years ago now, at a meeting, where he contrasted three approaches to AI. AI through design, which is characterizes 40, 50 years of good hard science. AI through statistical machine learning, which characterizes a great deal of current work, perhaps not in cognitive systems, but to an extent, but certainly in machine learning and in artificial intelligence. But he preferred, and I agree with him, the term self-generated AI. So AI is orchestrated by the processes that generate it. It's a nice circularity here, and circularity, as we'll see, is an important part of models of cognition. So it's one thing to say, yes, we'll self-generate our AI, but the question is, well, yeah, fine, how? There are two components here. There's the phylogeny of your system, that is how you're configured when you're born, and then your ontogenesis, that is what happens to you as you continue to exist and explore in the world around you. So for my purposes today, by phylogeny, I mean a cognitive architecture. It's a term which is laden with other meanings, but I'll try and clarify exactly what I mean in terms of the iCub today. Ontogenesis then is this process of developmental learning. And I have the word motivations there because that's critical. Something's got to drive the developmental process. And I'll speak more about that in a moment. I want to first introduce two diagrams that Umberto Maturana and Francesco Varela introduced, I think, 1987, because they, for me, capture in a very, very simple ideogram exactly what we're speaking of here. We have an agent. This circular arrow here is an autonomous system, which is self-organizing. And it is not controlled by its world. It interacts and is perturbed by it. And it also perturbs back. So this is what we would call a co-determined, structurally coupled system. But the coupling between the motor surfaces and the sensor surfaces are particularly simple. And perturbation is only affected by the environment, back and forth, like that. So it subsists, it exists, but it doesn't develop. So it's an autonomous system. They introduced then the idea of this second circle here, and this introduces the idea of development and the introduction of cognition. Cognition then becomes possible when you have in the system itself a nervous system. That nervous system allows a much more plastic mapping between your sensor and motor surfaces. And it's not a mapping that's given a priori, it's a mapping that's developed as you enact your way through the world around you. What's significant here, though, is not only do we have a perturbation by the environment on the system and vice versa, we also have a perturbation of the system on itself. So we have the concept of a self-modifying system, or if you want, self-developing. And as Klaas van Hofsten put it in one of his papers, development then is the result of a process with two foci. One is the nervous system, and the other is the subject's dynamic interactions with the environment. And the two, the interplay between the two, the dynamics between the two, is what allow cognitive capability to occur. Again, remembering that cognitive capability is to do with enlarging, extending our prospective capability. Therefore, to do anticipation, planning, deliberation, if you want, or prediction, to use more conventional terms. And then finally, you can put that together and see how agents ping off one another, how they interact with one another, how they perturb one another. And it's in this inter-agent interaction that you get the emergence of a common epistemology, a common understanding of the world around you, and one which is generatively dependent on your functional capabilities as an autonomous agent. So to summarize this, cognition then is about sense-making. It's a process whereby you as an agent discover the regularities in the world around you which make sense for your continued existence in it. And perception, action, and cognition are one single cohesive process, which are extending your prospective ability in the context of your ongoing action and perception. The goal being to try and extend your space of interactions. I'll make one point here. The learning process, this process of extending your space of interactions, is not monotonic. My favorite example, again drawn from the developmental psychology, is that when babies learn to walk, they learn to walk badly, and they're very unsuccessful at it. They fall down all the time. Why do this when they already have an extraordinarily good mechanism for getting from A to B and tearing everything out of the cupboards in the kitchen? They crawl very, very quickly. But there is a non-monotonicity in that development and that learning, which allows them somehow to give up on being able to do something pretty well, to do something worse, because ultimately it will be better. So that non-monotonicity of development learning is actually something which is important and quite difficult to model. So this then summarizes where I've arrived at in terms of substantiating the reason behind the development of a humanoid for cognitive systems research, and trying to summarize the idea that development's place in it is a way of extending your space of interaction. There's one important thing that I've left out here, and Rolf Pfeiffer will never forgive me if I don't make the important point that the morphology, and Josh will say more about this afternoon, the morphology of your system is not just important as an enabler, it is actually a constitutive part of the entire model. And it's part of that process of co-determination, co-development. The consequence of that is that your morphology should be plastic, it should be capable of changing. I guess we turn a blind eye to that in the robotics community because it's very difficult to implement. You know, if we had better components, if we had components which were capable of changing their morphology, and if we had models which were capable of dealing with that, we would have a better discipline and a better science. Well, we don't. But just because we don't have the materials today doesn't mean that we shouldn't forget the importance of it in the overall context of the model. And that's something, again, that I'll come back at the end of the talk when I talk about where we should be putting our efforts in the future in terms of bringing forward the discipline of developmental cognitive systems. So to really drive it home once again, then all of this cognitive development is about doing these two things. It's about increasing your degree of prospection, and it is about increasing the complexity of your action space. Which was all fine, and it occupied our thoughts for several years. But people kept saying to us, yeah, that's fine, but you need to build a system. And so as part of that, we put together a set of requirements for the phylogeny of the iCub. So this is our cognitive architecture. And again, I really want to emphasize that these were driven by the neuroscientists and they were driven by the developmental psychologists, and we had many arguments as roboticists and computational modelers with them. I think they won more often than we did. Which means that we probably didn't do as much as we wanted, but what we did is better founded. And I think, therefore, will be a better platform for making progress in the future. The first thing is that we need to remember that we're dealing with a network of cooperating and competing circuits. And I mentioned earlier, this idea of reentrance is critical to cognitive systems. And each one has a limited encoding. There's no one unique coding of anything, so there's a lot of redundancy in cognitive systems. The second issue is the one which speaks to development, and that is the idea of self-modification. There are two issues here. We mentioned this morning the distinction, if there was one, between learning and development. I'll introduce it in an artificial way here. I'll talk about learning to talk about tuning your phylogenetic skills, parameter estimation if you want, and development then is a way of changing your system dynamics. Which is actually modifying yourself. Personally, I think learning is probably a good umbrella term to cover all of it. But it makes sense in this context to make that distinction. The self-modification, by the way, I've used the term here, model generation. Model generation is critical because what you're trying to do is make sense of the world. Not that you're trying to abstract that unique representation that's shared by everybody, but rather that you're trying to create a representation of the world which makes sense to you as you interact with the world. Something drives that development, and you need exploratory motives. There are two things which drive this. The first is the drive to discover novel regularities in the world. There is lawfulness in the universe in which we live, and our drive is to discover what that lawfulness is. And invent, I use the word intentionally, to invent explanations of it. See how well they work and accept them or throw them out depending on how they work. And I don't mean in any sense that this is done consciously. It is just something which is part of the dynamic of interaction. And then there's the potential of your own actions. That's the second exploration motive, is the idea that what we want to do is explore what we can do, what is the limits of our capabilities. The transition from crawling to walking would be a good example of that transition, of that development. Very, very strongly, though, as well, we have the social motives. And these social motives are crucial to scaffolding what it is you're learning as you explore as a simple agent. So agent interaction, the idea of getting mutually constructed patterns of behavior between agents. In a way, it's a form of reinforcement learning. And of course, there are different types of learning as well. There's learning which is reinforcement, there's learning which is supervised, and then there's unsupervised learning. So all of these types of learning are recruited in a system. You also need a mechanism which will allow you to rehearse hypothetical scenarios to say, well, so you've got counterfactual reasoning. What if this happened, or what might be the case? And that's used then to moderate your behavior. And finally, you have to have action-perception coupling, so you need your rich embodiment. This takes me now more into the area of engineering, and this is the iCub stack, if I can call it that. At the bottom, we have here our digital signal processors, our DSP, and our hub with our gigabit Ethernet, and a middleware layer here, which is what allows us to implement our system as a system of distributed multiprocessor modules. And then sitting on top of that, we have our software, which I've divided here for convenience into capabilities which are based on the phylogeny of the system, and then capabilities which are based on the development of the system. So that was the original idea. This gave us our first diagrammatic encapsulation of a cognitive architecture. You have at the bottom here all of your perceptual motor couplings. You have here something which is modulating it, telling it, and selecting and sort of inhibiting certain motor signals and movements. And then on top of that, this is a combination of heteroassociative memories which are pinging off one another. This was based on Murray Shanahan's work, and the idea that prospection can be accomplished by having two heteroassociative memories simulating what would be going on in the world. And of course, somehow they have to be trained by what you've actually experienced as you've gone through. So this was what guided the development of our cognitive architecture and our cognitive systems for quite some time. That diagram still isn't the design of a cognitive system. It's still not something a software engineer can take, say, yeah, great. Okay, come back in 6 months and I'll have it ready for you. Which, of course, as engineers, we need to build. So let me now carry on and finish the story that I've started, which is to show you exactly how we've gone about implementing this system on the iCub robot. I wanted to pick out these key issues to pave the way for that. The issue of development is focused here upon improving the predictive performance and increasing the space of viable actions of the iCub. The idea of internal simulation is very important as well. And again, it's to do with predicting future events. And you can run time backwards, and the opposite of predicting future events is reconstructing what happened. And that retrospective look, as well as, is just the counterpart of your prospection. And it can also involve the creation or the invention of possible explanations. It isn't just purely recall. We do this post hoc justification all the time as humans. And then finally, an issue which is important in the idea of imagination, using internal simulation as a way of imagining how things could be and imagining new ideas. This is something that Linda mentioned this morning towards the end. And I'll talk about that in my wrap-up. The second issue is the motivation, that we've got exogenous motivations and we've got endogenous. So motivations which come from within, and motivations for exploration, and motivations for exploration which come from without. I've used these terms here instead of using the terms top-down and bottom-up, because top-down and bottom-up imply some kind of hierarchical structure, and I in no way want to suggest that there is a hierarchy of processing going on in the cognitive architecture. It's a dynamic network of cooperating and competing subsystems. So this is the final cognitive architecture of the iCub. There are a number of boxes. I'll walk you through this very, very briefly, and then I'll show you some examples. So the idea is that we've got a saliency-based attention system here, coupled with an episodic memory, which is a way of collecting your experiences as you wander around or gaze around the world, a procedural memory which links them together with your action experience, all of which are controlling your gaze, and this is also influencing your affective state, which influences your action selection system. Again, all connected to your locomotion and your reaching and grasping. A key thing here is that all of these subsystems are recruited all the time. Whether or not they are actually causing action depends on what's going on here in your affective state. So let me pick out a couple of them. I started the talk with a description of the iCub head. So gaze control, we've already talked about, and I've shown you some smooth pursuit and some tracking through occlusion. So that works very, very well. Reaching and grasping, we've already seen. So we've got the hand-eye coordination and grasping and manipulation, and that's part of the architecture. Crawling, we've seen for our locomotion. And then the attention subsystem, which is not as sophisticated as the attention subsystem that Linda would like, but it's on the road there. And I think what's important is it's entirely compatible with what Linda has been talking about. We then have something I haven't mentioned so far, and this is the idea of an episodic memory. Now this is entirely consistent with the issues that Linda was talking about this morning. The idea that we build a set of memories of the world as we look around them. This morning, Linda talked about the idea of looking at objects and then actually placing them within your field of view so that they occupy the majority of the field of view here. This is something that the iCub would easily be able to do and hasn't done yet. Instead, we have adopted a foliated sensor for both eyes. So this here is a log polar representation of the view from the right eye of the iCub. The point of a foliated sensor is that the information which is at the center of your gaze is much more predominant than the information at the periphery. And so what we have here is just a snapshot based, and effectively they're recalled as an associative memory using hue and saturation. This is the original reconstructed log polar image. So a foliated set of snapshots as you gaze around the world. There are other attempts at implementing an episodic memory by other members of the RobotCub consortium, and I won't talk about that. The procedural memory then is a way of linking these episodic memories together in some skill-based representation. It's simply, in the 1970s, we would have called it a semantic net, but it's a semantic net which is based on experience, and it's built from experience. So it's a way of collecting your perceptions and linking them to other perceptions through actions. And of course, these links are weighted based on the number of times that you've encountered them as you've explored the world around you. So it's a weighted digraph or a weighted net of perception, action, experiences. And you can recall from that associatively or heteroassociatively by presenting one or two of the triples in a perception action sequence. This is exactly the same model that has been used in a separate competence that has been implemented on the iCub, which is about learning affordances. That is, learning through experiment what an object can do for you in terms of your own ability to manipulate it. The affordance model here, built by IST in Lisbon, again has a triple. You have an object, an effect, and an action. And then if you present it with an object and an effect, you can associatively recall the action, and vice versa. If I give you an effect, you can find out what the linking action and objects are. So that type of procedural memory is consistent with our other work in learning affordances. The episodic memory then feeds back down into the endogenous salience module. And again, I emphasize that the salience system here is exactly the EUCogII salience model that Linda talked about this morning, with some additional features. In this case, your endogenous salience is being effectively conditioned by what it is you remember from where you've been gazing around in the world. And that, if you want, then can be used for segmentation, again using hue and saturation. You can do it different ways, and I mentioned this morning that IST in Lisbon have been using a SIFT-based object recognition salience system. in order to condition what is most salient in the visual sphere around you. The affective state then is built as a very, very, very simple spiking models, 2 spiking models, one implementing curiosity and the other implementing experimentation. So the idea is that if you have a new event as you explore, or an event that you haven't seen for a while, that will give rise to a curiosity spike, and then over time, whatever spikes are present along some temporal axis which are weighted towards the most recent one, they're all summed and they give you a level of curiosity. And the same thing happens for your experimentation. So if you have predicted an event and subsequently encounter that event, then clearly your predictive system is working, and that will keep that motivation going. And then, really very simple, the action selection module is just selecting the maximum of the 2 curiosity levels. That's all put together then in a system of coarse-grained, concurrently executed software modules. And that's for the attention subsystem, and that's for the memory subsystem and affective and gaze control system. The only thing I put this up here is to show you that there's a big difference in having a diagram with lines and arrows and the final blueprint for your software design. It tends to get complex really quickly if you're not careful. And that's necessary. The other issue here is in terms of the reentrance couplings, that this is not a feed-forward or system, that there are reentrant couplings between between several of the modules. And it is the dynamics of the interaction between the modules that you get your cognitive behavior and your cognitive development. Let me say that again because it's crucial. We tried very, very hard not to fall into the old trap of embedding a state machine in our system, because that would have been just going back to knowledge in another form. Instead, the cognitive behavior is based on the dynamics of interaction between the modules, which makes it very difficult to work with, but it's a necessary complexity. You just have to grasp it and deal with it. So now I can turn to the thesis for discussion, which was cognition emerges during development in the close interplay of experience, of the social and physical environment, and of the neuronal mechanisms of growth. Yes. An understanding of cognition cannot be achieved without an understanding of the development of cognition. Yes. And thus, it's a necessity for artificial cognitive systems to take development on board. Let me think. Yes. So maybe it's just my background, but I think it's a wonderful thesis, and I think it's entirely supportable, and I hope the community carries on supporting it for many years and making a lot of progress in it. But if I think myself back at what we've done, and here I'm just thinking, I'm not actually doing anything, the doing will come. If I think about that for a short while, for me there are a couple of, well, not a couple, there are several key issues which require very urgent attention in moving forward. The RobotCub project itself is at an end, it's finished, but the project with a capital P will carry on, I hope, in many guises for many years to come. The first one I've put up here is the issue of imagination. This idea of exploring new ways of interpreting your data purely through, not conscious introspection, but for me as an engineer, I mean, the way I would look at it would be to look at my procedural memory, and I would try and see, are there, Linda said, first order, second order, third order, fourth order patterns which are present in that learning experience. We haven't done that yet, but I think that there's very fruitful research work to be done in looking for those second and third order patterns, and then subsequently modifying the states of your procedural memory to reflect them, to bring them to the fore, so that they then influence how it is you behave and act going forward. Self-modification is crucial. That is what development is about. It isn't just being purely reactive to external forces. It's about using what you've learned to modify your own state space, to enhance your prospection and to extend your space of interaction. And it's hard, of course, I mean, that's a circular problem, and it's hard to model circularity computationally, but it's something that we need. It implies a need for plasticity. If you look at my diagram of my cognitive architecture, anyone who's a software engineer here will know immediately that that could be really brittle, in the sense that If it's all not working properly connected together, you're not going to get anything. And that's entirely true. So the idea of plasticity and redundancy is not part of the current cognitive architecture, and I think it's crucial that until you start putting redundancy into your system, and still until you have a plasticity in the interconnectivity, you won't have that resilience that you get. You may get some interesting behavior, you may get some cognitive development, but I don't think you'll get something that's robust. So I think embedding that in your system is crucial. And of course, this then speaks to the issue of internal dynamics. As I've tried to debug this software, what I really lack is a mathematical methodology to stand back from it and model it. Instead of just hoping, as you tend to do as software engineers, that it will exhibit the behavior you want. So we would like to prescribe certain behaviors, but we do not want to prescribe the algorithms by which they will emerge, because then we'll be falling into the old trap. And the only way I see out of this is to come up with a mathematics which will allow you to model the dynamics of interaction of your modules and to see how they would behave mathematically. Social motives are crucial, and I've said very little in this talk about social motives, not because they're not important, but because we've done some work in EPFL, in imitation, and in Hertfordshire on interaction histories. But there's so much more work to be done. It really is the motive that scaffolds what it is you learn through your own self-exploration. And then finally, I think it was Gerald Edelman made this point in his book, that if you have a cognitive system, somewhere you have to have a value system. Something is driving the motivations. There's got to be some, if you want an engineering viewpoint, it's a cost function. And it's got to be, but it's got to be there. And it's not something we've attended to greatly. My own take on it is the cognitive systems are anti-entropy engines. They are systems which somehow create order, see sense in the information that's around them and in the world in which they're living. To be able to deal with that more mathematically and more formally, I think, is going to be crucial to making long-term progress. So I want to say thank you with a new laptop and a K in the wrong place. But nonetheless, thank you from me for your kind attention and your forbearance at that intentional pause in the middle of the talk. And thank you from all of these people as well, because I'm here only as a messenger, which is my other way of saying, you can ask me questions, but please don't shoot me. And I'll leave you with this thought, which for me encapsulates a large part of what's driven the development of the iCub humanoid robot and our conception of what developmental cognition is all about. Thank you.